She was a princess cast out from the throne, and he was nothing more than a silent blacksmith with a mysterious scar across his face. The king's soldiers mocked the lowly man for daring to shelter the kingdom's outcast, until he drew a broken short blade and revealed a truth so terrifying that the entire force fell to their knees in fear.
The kingdom of Valdemar sat between gray mountains and silver rivers, ancient and proud. King Aldrich ruled it wisely, but he was aging, and everyone at court knew it. His daughter, Princess Elowen, had grown up in silk and gold, sharp-tongued, brilliant, and completely convinced that rank was the only language worth speaking. She wasn't cruel by design. She had simply never once been asked to survive. The night of her formal recognition as heir began with ceremony and candlelight. It ended with her uncle, Lord Cassian, presenting forged documents to the royal council, documents claiming Elowen was not the king's true blood. The council, already bribed, voted swiftly. Guards escorted her out through the servants' entrance while a thunderstorm swallowed the sky. No carriage, no escort, no goodbye from her father, who sat too weak and too stunned to stand. She walked for hours. By the end, she was barefoot, her dress torn at the hem, moving through forest roads she had never needed to learn. The cold reached her faster than humility ever had. She collapsed at the foot of a mountain pass, pride still clutched in both hands, though even that was beginning to slip. The man who said nothing and did everything. Built into the mountainside, half hidden by pines, was a stone forge. Smoke rose through a crack in the rock, the only sign of life for miles. Inside lived Soren, large, quiet, with a scar running from his left brow to his jaw. He worked alone, ate alone, and delivered finished ironwork to the valley below under cover of darkness. The villagers called him the ghost of the mountain. Nobody knew his past, nobody asked. He was returning from a late delivery when he nearly tripped over Elowen in the road. She was barely conscious. Her first words, even half delirious, came out like a command. "Don't touch me, I am—" Then she passed out. Soren picked her up and carried her up the mountain in silence. No drama, no hesitation, just a man doing what needed doing. She woke to wood smoke and dry bread. The forge was rough, warm, and strangely ordered. Tools hung with precision, books stacked on every flat surface, a single candle burning beside a worn Latin text. Soren sat across the room sharpening a blade, not looking at her. She demanded to know who he was. He said nothing. She demanded to leave. He pointed to the window. A blizzard had sealed the mountain pass. She was trapped, with a mute, scarred blacksmith, in a cave, in a storm. This, I told myself when I read it, was God's sense of irony at its finest.
The first days were friction. Elowen criticized the food, the smell, the silence, the absence of a proper bed. Soren absorbed all of it with a calm so complete it infuriated her more than anger ever could. And so, out of sheer cold and boredom, she began to watch him instead. He never wasted a movement. He read every night by candlelight, and each morning, before touching a single tool, he picked up a small carved wooden horse near the forge door and held it for just a moment, quietly, like a prayer. She finally asked about it. He went still. Then, in a voice so low it barely registered, "My daughter." 2 words. The narrator in me had to stop there. There are sentences that contain entire lifetimes. That was one of them. The story came out in fragments over several days. Soren had a wife, Maren, and a daughter named Lysa, now 7. 3 years ago, Maren died of fever during a brutal winter. The same winter, the royal court sent no healers to the outer villages because they were hosting a political summit. Lysa now lived with Maren's sister in the valley. Safer, warmer, fed. Soren had chosen the mountain because he could not look at his daughter without seeing everything he had failed to save. He sent money. He left carved toys at the base of the path. He had not held her in 8 months. That night, Elowen stared at her own hands, soft, uncalloused, untouched by consequence. She thought about the political summit Soren had mentioned. She had worn a blue gown to that summit. She had complained the soup was undersalted. I don't think she cried because she pitied him, I wrote in the margin of the journal. I think she cried because she finally understood she had been part of the machine that broke him. She asked him to teach her something. He taught her to pump the bellows, then to hold tongs, then to read the temperature of metal by its color. She burned herself twice and said nothing. Soren noticed. A traveling merchant brought news. Lord Cassian's mercenaries were sweeping the region for a fugitive woman of noble bearing. The reward was large. The orders, the merchant hinted, were not to bring her back alive. Soren said nothing to the merchant. That evening, he quietly slid the forge's outer bolt closed and moved his sleeping mat closer to the door. While reorganizing his bookshelves, Elowen found a folded letter, old, sealed with the royal crest, addressed to Commander S. It was signed by King Aldrich himself, dated 10 years prior. It thanked the commander for laying down his rank, his name, and his face to draw enemy forces away from the capital during the siege of the Iron Gate. The scar, the silence, the self-imposed exile on a mountain where no one would recognize him. He didn't lose his voice, I thought. He lost everything else first. The voice just followed. 6 mercenaries arrived at dusk, following smoke trails up the pass. Their leader was theatrical and smug, calling Soren the devil's ugly son as they dragged Elowen into the open. When the leader raised his sword, Soren stepped between them and reached beneath his work apron. He produced a half-melted gold medallion, deliberately destroyed so he could never be ordered back, but still recognizable. The mercenaries went pale. That was the seal of the immortal commander, the man who had held the Iron Gate alone for 3 days. What followed was not a battle, it was a demonstration. Soren disarmed all 6 men in under 2 minutes, calm as a man completing a familiar chore. No one was killed, everyone was left alive and deeply humiliated.
They sat by the low forge fire that night, the storm finally quiet. After a long silence, Elowen asked, "Why didn't you go back? You could have reclaimed everything." Soren was quiet for a while. Then, "I didn't want everything. I wanted Maren to live. That wasn't something I could fight for." I had to put the journal down after that line. I'm from New England. We don't cry at things. But I cried. A messenger arrived from the capital. King Aldrich had stripped Cassian of power after a loyalist faction exposed the forgery. Elowen's title, her rooms, her future, all formally restored. She held the letter for a long time. Then she folded it, set it on the forge, and looked at Soren. She did not return immediately. Instead, she sent a legally binding letter to the capital, requiring royal healers to be permanently stationed in outer villages, signed with her full title before anything else. Then, she walked down the mountain beside Soren without a word. She waited outside while he knocked on his sister-in-law's door. She watched from a distance as he crouched down, as Lysa saw him, as the little girl ran. I had to put the journal down again at that part. A man who had swallowed so much grief, folding his daughter into his arms like she was the only solid thing left in the world. I am not ashamed of the crying.